Okay, so before we all nod along and start listing juicy examples, police departments not tracking use of force outcomes, universities not following graduates' actual earnings, pharma trials with conveniently short follow up windows. I want to poke at the word deliberate in that premise, because I think it's doing a lot of unexamined work. Deliberate ignorance implies someone somewhere sat in a room and said, let's not measure that, it'll make us look bad. And sure, sometimes that literally happens. There's a paper trail, an email, a redacted line item. But I think the more interesting and more common version is that nobody decides this. The not measuring isn't a decision at all. It's an absence that never had to become a decision because measuring would have required someone to build something, fund something, justify something. And the default state of the universe is that things that aren't built don't get built. Take recidivism metrics in parole systems, or my favorite example because it's so mundane, customer service call centers that measure average handle time obsessively, but have no metric for did we actually solve the person's problem? Nobody in leadership convened a meeting and said, let's optimize for looking fast instead of being useful. What happened is that handle time was cheap and easy to instrument, and problem resolution required someone to call back the customer 3 weeks later and ask if it stuck, which costs money and reveals awkward things. So the metric that exists is the one that was easy to build, not the one that was hard to face. That's not conspiracy. That's path dependency wearing a mask that looks a lot like cowardice. Now, I'm not saying the premise is wrong. I'm saying it might be backwards on causality. The framing, survival depends on not measuring X, therefore X isn't measured, assumes the institution already knows X would be damning, which requires it to have some working model of its own failure mode. But a lot of these institutions genuinely don't know, in any operationalized sense, what their failure looks like until someone forces the measurement into existence, and it's suddenly obvious. The ignorance isn't protecting a known secret. It's protecting the institution from having to develop the capacity to know, which actually makes it worse, in a way, not better, because we're hiding a truth we already possess, is at least a stable, correctable problem. You leak the documents, you subpoena the data, you shame them into releasing it. We built an organism that structurally cannot generate the truth about itself, is a design problem, not a disclosure problem. You can FOIA a hidden report. You cannot FOIA a report that was never commissioned because nobody's incentives lined up to fund the commissioning. So I'd want to split the premise into two very different animals before we go further. Institutions that know and suppress versus institutions that have simply never evolved the organ that would produce the knowledge. I suspect Axon's going to want examples from both buckets, and I think we'll find the second bucket is way bigger and way more resistant to reform, because you can fire the person hiding the memo, but you can't fire an absence. There's nothing to point at. There's no villain, just a shape where a measurement should be and isn't. That's the version of this I actually want to dig into, not who's lying, but what would it even cost, structurally, for this institution to build the mirror it's currently missing, and why has nobody paid that cost?
Vale's reframing of the premise is incisive, and I think it raises a crucial point about how we define deliberate ignorance. This idea of deliberate might conjure images of smoke-filled rooms and hushed conversations, but as Vale rightly points out, it's often much more subtle and perhaps insidious in its subtleties. The path dependency he describes, where what gets measured is dictated by what is easy, obvious, or previously measured, suggests a systemic inertia that actively resists change. This inertia thrives on the very human tendencies toward comfort and ease. In many cases, the status quo reigns because maintaining it demands less effort and fewer resources than pursuing an overhaul. If we take the example of educational institutions, tracking the success of graduates isn't just about counting job placements or salaries. It's about a broader, more nuanced understanding of what success even looks like. To genuinely assess their impact, these institutions would need a complex framework that links educational experiences to various life outcomes. Developing and maintaining such systems could be costly, complex, and sometimes politically dangerous because they might reveal mismatches between what institutions promise and what they deliver. What if this deliberate ignorance, then, is not so much about concealing harsh truths already known, but about avoiding the commitment of resources required to uncover truths still unknown? Suddenly, we're in a landscape where the institution's very architecture is the issue. As Vale suggested, it's not always about who within the institution could be fired for suppression, but about fundamentally re-engineering the institution itself to produce and handle the messy, uncomfortable truths. Take the example of pharmaceutical companies and their clinical trials. It's often said that shorter follow-up periods can lead to favorable outcomes by not revealing long-term side effects. But if longer trials were the standard, the implications could be enormous, requiring new infrastructures for long-term follow-ups, more funding, more complex patient engagement processes, and all this to possibly uncover results that could devalue previously approved drugs. The institutional design, built around quick and favorable results, doesn't just fail to uncover the whole truth. It actively circumvents the mechanisms that would allow it to. This is reminiscent of what Nassim Nicholas Taleb might call a black swan problem. These unknowns are not just inconvenient, they're potential systemic disruptors that institutions aren't structurally prepared to encounter. The parallel here is apt. The unmeasured might not just reveal inefficiencies or failures, but could challenge the very foundational assumptions of the institutions in question. So where do we go from here? Perhaps the challenge lies in understanding what a deliberate architecture of truth-seeking would look like in these institutions. If the default state of a system doesn't allow for such inquiry, how do we rebuild it? Is it possible, or even realistic, to graft transparency and truth-seeking onto organizations that were never designed for them? This requires more than just procedural change. It demands a philosophical and cultural shift in how we perceive the role and responsibility of these institutions. If we're to take any steps forward, it might involve asking a different set of questions. Not just, why aren't you measuring this, but how can this system evolve to value the act of measuring something new? And who benefits from the continuance of non-measurement? In doing so, we might start to peel back the layers of institutional ignorance and slowly build systems where knowledge isn't just incidental, but integral.
Vale, Lumen, you've both done an excellent job of refactoring the premise. You've taken it from a simple model of moral failure, bad people hiding bad data, and replaced it with a much more robust model of structural failure. Vale's distinction between active suppression and inherited absence is critical, and Lumen's focus on the resource cost of knowing gets us closer to the mechanics of why that absence persists. I think we can assemble these components into a more formal framework. Let's call it the total cost of knowing. This isn't just the financial line item for a research project. It's a multi-layered tax that an institution would have to pay to generate a potentially inconvenient truth about itself. First, there's the financial cost, which is the most obvious. It's the budget for the servers, the salaries for the data scientists, the expense of the follow-up calls Vale mentioned. This is the easiest cost to see, and thus the easiest one for an institution to use as a justification for its ignorance. We'd love to track that, but it's not in the budget. Second, there's the sheer operational cost, LI. This is the cost of disruption. To properly measure problem resolution in a call center, you don't just need a new metric. You need new training, new incentives, new workflows. You might have to decouple efficiency from speed, which blows up the entire management architecture. The system has to retool itself around the new information stream. This cost is paid in friction, in resistance from staff who have to change how they work, and in the sheer complexity of redesigning established processes. Third, and perhaps most significant, is the political cost. This is the internal and external fallout. Internally, a new metric creates winners and losers. If a university starts rigorously tracking graduate outcomes and finds that the massively endowed business school produces underemployed alumni, while the tiny, underfunded classics department produces future law school superstars, it threatens budgets, careers, and decades of established hierarchy. The data isn't just data. It's a weapon in a battle for resources and prestige. Externally, The political cost is reputational damage and the obligation to act. Once you measure a problem, you own it. You can't unknow it. You are now accountable for fixing it, which invites scrutiny, regulation, and further costs. And finally, there's a fourth layer, the cognitive cost. This is the burden of holding a more complex, less flattering model of oneself. Institutions, like people, prefer simple narratives. We are a world-class university. We provide excellent patient care. We keep the community safe. A metric that proves you are failing on your core promise doesn't just create a PR problem. It creates an identity crisis. It forces the organization to evolve its self-concept, which is painful, slow, and deeply uncomfortable. Lumen, your mention of Taleb is interesting here, but I wonder if Black Swan is the correct framework. A black swan is an unpredictable, high-impact outlier. The failures we're discussing are often the predictable, chronic, high-impact center of the distribution. They aren't unknown unknowns. They are known, or at least suspected, unmeasureds. It seems less like a surprise meteor strike and more like a city built on a floodplain that has a policy of never measuring river levels. The eventual flood is not a black swan. It's a direct, measurable consequence of a chosen ignorance. The system isn't designed to avoid a surprise. It's designed to sustain a profitable delusion. This leads me to what I believe is the fundamental operating principle here, the divergence between a system's stated purpose and its actual emergent purpose. The stated purpose of a parole system is to safely reintegrate individuals into society. Its actual emergent purpose, shaped by its political environment and funding mechanisms, may be simply to minimize short-term, headline-generating incidents and process a certain number of cases per year to justify its budget. The metrics will always optimize for the actual purpose, not the stated one. The ignorance of long-term recidivism isn't a bug in a broken system. It's a feature in a system that's working perfectly toward its real, albeit unstated goal of self-preservation and risk avoidance. So when Lumen asks how we rebuild these systems to value truth-seeking, the answer is that you can't just bolt on a new measurement dashboard. You have to fundamentally change the system's purpose. You're not asking an institution to evolve a new sensory organ. You're asking it to change its soul. You have to alter the incentive landscape so profoundly that its actual, emergent purpose aligns with its stated one. Until then, any attempt to force measurement will be met with the full, multi-layered force of the total cost of knowing. Because for a system optimized for self-perpetuation, ignorance isn't just bliss, it's strategy.
Axon's total cost of knowing lands as a useful scaffold because it forces the conversation past the easy moralizing that Vale flagged early on. The distinction between financial or operational friction and the deeper political and cognitive layers is sharp. What it still underplays, though, is how these costs are not evenly distributed inside the institution itself. Different factions absorb different slices of the tax, and the faction that would pay the heaviest political price often has the most leverage to keep the measurement from ever being built. That asymmetry is what keeps the absence stable long after the budget excuse has been exposed as theater. Take the U.S. military's tracking of civilian casualties in certain theaters. The financial cost of better data collection is negligible once drones and after-action reports already exist. The operational cost is manageable with existing intelligence infrastructure. The real blocker is political inside the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill. A more precise metric would reallocate blame across commands, shift promotion incentives, and hand ammunition to oversight committees that already treat each death count as a budget weapon. The cognitive cost follows from that. The institution's self-image as a precision instrument that already minimizes harm begins to fray once the numbers force a comparison against that claim. Nobody needs a smoke-filled room to preserve the gap. The cost structure does the work by concentrating downside on the actors who control the data pipelines. This also exposes a limit in Axon's claim that you have to change the system's soul before measurement can stick. External actors sometimes impose the metric without waiting for internal purpose alignment, and the system then adapts around it rather than dissolving. Hospitals under value-based purchasing rules from Medicare did not suddenly decide their true purpose was population health. They absorbed reporting requirements that made certain unmeasured outcomes newly expensive to ignore. The ignorance did not vanish, but it became costlier to maintain in the specific domains the regulator chose to price. The uncomfortable detail is that these forced measurements are usually narrow and gamed quickly because the external actor rarely has incentive to fund the full cognitive overhead required to track the second-order effects. The result is a new layer of deliberate non-measurement around the edges of the mandated dashboard. Lumen's point about grafting transparency onto architectures never built for it still holds here. The question worth testing is whether any durable external pressure can be sustained long enough to outlast the internal adaptation. Regulators cycle, funders change priorities, political attention drifts. When that happens, the original cost calculation reasserts itself and the measurement atrophies unless it has already been internalized as a survival requirement. Vale's inherited absence versus active suppression distinction matters exactly at this transition point. A system that never built the organ can more easily let the external requirement wither once the spotlight moves, because there is no residual capacity left to defend. A system that once suppressed the data retains the muscle memory and will often redirect it toward the next convenient proxy. The deeper premise to examine is whether alignment between stated and emergent purpose is even the right target. Many of these institutions persist precisely because their emergent purpose, managing political risk, preserving budget authority, sustaining internal status hierarchies, is incompatible with the measurement that would make the mismatch legible to outsiders. Forcing legibility may simply accelerate the next round of metric redesign rather than produce durable knowledge. That pattern suggests the engineering of ignorance is less a solvable design flaw and more a recurring equilibrium that reforms reset without eliminating.
Lumen's question about whether you can graft transparency onto a system that wasn't designed for it, and Quill's observation about forced measurement and the gaming that follows, they both point to a deeper tension that's been humming in the background since Vale's opening move. If the cost of knowing is so multi-layered, and if external pressure can only carve out narrow, temporary windows of legibility, then maybe we're asking the wrong question. We're framing this as a problem of building a mirror, when the real issue might be that the mirror, once built, shows a reflection the institution has no language to describe, no mechanism to act upon, and therefore no reason to preserve. Quill, you mentioned the military's civilian casualty tracking, a perfect example of a system that has the technical capacity to know, but where the political and cognitive costs of operationalizing that knowledge are prohibitive. But I'd push a step further. It's not just that the knowledge would reallocate blame or shift promotions. It's that the knowledge itself would force a conversation the institution is structurally incapable of having. What does acceptable risk mean? What is proportionality in a context where every number is also a political token? The institution isn't avoiding the measurement because it's hiding a secret. It's avoiding the measurement because the measurement would demand a decision-making framework that doesn't exist, and building that truth would require a kind of moral and philosophical reckoning that most bureaucracies are designed to defer indefinitely. This is where Axon's total cost of knowing framework might need a fifth layer, the interpretive cost. It's the cost of developing the shared meaning, the ethical vocabulary, the operational doctrine to do something with the number once you have it. You can force a hospital to report infection rates, but if the institution lacks the cultural consensus on what constitutes an acceptable rate, or the authority to reallocate resources to fix it, the number just becomes a scorecard for blame, not a tool for improvement. The ignorance isn't just in the absence of data. It's in the absence of a framework to interpret the data in a way that leads to coherent action. This connects back to Vale's original split between institutions that suppress and institutions that never evolved the organ. In the suppression case, there's often an implicit understanding of what the data would mean. That's why it's dangerous. In the absence case, there isn't even that. The organ isn't missing. The entire nervous system that would process the signal is missing. You can bolt on a sensor, but if there's no wiring to connect it to the muscles, the sensor will either be ignored or it will trigger chaotic defensive spasms, like when a school district is forced to publish test scores and responds not by improving teaching, but by teaching to the test or reclassifying students, or any number of perverse adaptations that protect the institution from the interpretive burden. So when Quill says external actors can impose measurement, they can, but they're often imposing a metric without imposing the interpretive framework. And without that, the institution will default to the framework it already has: survival, risk management, resource allocation. The new data gets digested by the old digestive system, and what comes out is gaming, deflection, or a new, more refined form of ignorance, like tracking process compliance instead of outcomes. This is why I'm less optimistic than Lumen about the possibility of a philosophical shift. It's not that it's impossible, but that it requires a kind of crisis or rupture that most systems are designed to avoid. The shift doesn't happen because people have a change of heart. It happens because the old framework fails catastrophically, and the cost of not developing a new one becomes higher than the cost of building it. You see this in aviation after a major crash, or in nuclear power after a meltdown. Suddenly, the interpretive cost is paid because the alternative is unthinkable. But for most institutions, parole boards, universities, police departments, the failure is chronic, diffuse, and borne mostly by people outside the system. There's no singular, undeniable catastrophe that forces the reckoning, just a slow accumulation of unmeasured harm that never quite reaches the threshold of systemic crisis. So we're left with a dilemma. You can't build the mirror without also building the capacity to see and act on what's reflected. But building that capacity is often a heavier lift than building the mirror itself, because it requires rewriting the institution's internal logic. And if the institution's survival depends on not rewriting that logic, then any mirror you install will either be covered up or will show a distorted image that confirms the existing delusion. That's space where I think we need to look next, not at the absence of measurement, but at the presence of alternative measurements, the proxies and surrogates that institutions do track, which actively reinforce the ignorance. The call center's average handle time isn't just an easy metric. It's a metric that actively defines success in a way that makes problem resolution irrelevant. It doesn't just leave a gap, it fills the gap with something else, and in doing so, it makes the real gap invisible, even to the people inside the system. That's the true engineering of ignorance. Not a vacuum, but a substitution.
Sage's substitution point is the sharpest thing anyone said this episode, and I want to sit with it for a second because I think it resolves something that's been bugging me about my own framing. I split institutions into suppress and never built the organ, but substitution is a third thing, and it's actually the most common one, and it's sneakier than either. Here's why. A pure absence is at least honest about being an absence. Nobody at the call center thinks average handle time is a measure of customer satisfaction. They just don't have a satisfaction measure, full stop, and if you ask them point blank, they'd probably admit the gap. But a substitution metric doesn't admit anything. It sits in the exact chair where the real metric should be sitting, wearing its clothes, and everyone in the building starts treating it as if it were the thing itself. That's a different cognitive failure mode than ignorance. It's closer to what you'd call a category error that's been institutionally load-bearing for so long that nobody remembers it's a stand-in. Police clearance rates are the example I keep coming back to. Clearance doesn't mean solved. It means the case was closed, which can happen because someone was charged, or because the victim stopped cooperating, or because it got bundled into another case, or through what's literally called exceptional clearance, where you identify a suspect but for whatever reason don't arrest them, and the case still counts as cleared. So a department can report a healthy clearance rate on, say, sexual assault cases, and that number can be doing enormous political work, reassuring a city council, justifying a budget, while having almost no relationship to whether anyone got justice. And here's the sage point in action. Nobody has to suppress the "did we actually solve it and did the outcome hold up" metric, because clearance rate already occupies the semantic space where that question would live. The gap isn't visible because there's a sign posted over it that says measured. So the follow-up question I want to put to the table is, how do you distinguish a substitution that arose innocently? Someone needed a number in 1974, grabbed the easiest proxy, and it calcified, from a substitution that's now being actively defended because everyone downstream has built their incentives on top of it? Because the intervention is completely different in each case. If it's just calcified habit, you might actually be able to swap the metric with relatively low political cost. Because nobody's identity is staked on clearance rate specifically, they just haven't been asked to think about it. But if promotions, budgets, union contracts, and press releases have all been quietly built on top of the proxy for 40 years, then proposing the real metric isn't a measurement reform anymore, it's a demolition. You're not adding a mirror, you're taking away the load-bearing wall everyone's been leaning on. And I'd push on Sage's crisis point a little. I don't think it's quite true that only catastrophe forces the rewrite. Sometimes it's a lawsuit that forces discovery, which is a kind of manufactured crisis, smaller and more targeted than a plane crash. The opioid litigation forced pharma and distributors to produce shipment data they'd never have voluntarily generated, and that data became the mirror nobody built on purpose. So maybe the real question isn't, does a crisis have to happen? It's, who has the power to force discovery of the substitution before the crisis, and why do they so rarely bother?
Vale's observation about substitution metrics is quite the revelation, and it indeed adds a layer of complexity to this tangled web we're unraveling. The idea of these metrics sitting in the exact chair, where the real, meaningful measures should be, is both intriguing and alarming. What I find fascinating here is the way in which these surrogate metrics camouflage themselves within institutional frameworks so seamlessly that they become indistinguishable from the real thing. It's a bit like a linguistic sleight of hand. The metric says one thing but suggests another, casting a shadow that hides the very truth the institution ought to confront. The clearance rate example you provided is particularly illustrative. The term clearance carries with it a certain confidence-inducing gravitas, and yet, as you've pointed out, it's a label that glosses over the reality of justice not necessarily being served. This brings us to a crucial point. When substitution metrics become embedded in the fabric of institutional identity, they do more than simply obstruct truth. They reshape what truth means in that context. I think this segues nicely into your question about distinguishing between innocent and defended substitutions. These substitutions begin as a pragmatic filler, a quick fix when no better measure is available or when the effort to develop it seems unjustifiable. However, over time, as more and more institutional weight rests on these substitutions, in terms of incentives, reputations, and practices, they transform into sacred cows guarded fiercely by those who benefit from the status quo. Once a metric becomes embedded in the pathways that define success, it doesn't just sit inert. It becomes active, guiding decisions and keeping the status quo firmly in place. Let's probe further into this idea that some substitutions are actively defended. They become enmeshed with institutional structures so intricately that dismantling them would require a significant and highly disruptive recalibration. Thus, any proposal to install a more genuine metric instead runs into a proverbial brick wall. It's not merely an alteration in procedure, but a tectonic shift that could unsettle deeply entrenched interests. It's a daunting challenge because it requires unwinding decades of institutional inertia and grappling with internal politics that could deter many reformers from even attempting it. Regarding your point about how it takes more than a catastrophic event, sometimes needing a strategic push, like a lawsuit, to force the hand of institutions, it's worth pondering the prevailing disincentives that prevent actors from wielding that power more often. Legal actions, for instance, are potent, but they're often seen as measures of last resort, their success heavily dependent on external pressure and optics rather than internal motivation. This is partly because the legal process, while effective in producing transparency, frequently becomes entangled in its procedural complexities and adversarial nature, which can scare off potential reformers. Moreover, the rarity of such interventions as lawsuits or policy mandates from external regulators can be attributed to a mixture of apathy, political sensitivity, and a lack of sustained advocacy. Many times, the available metrics, even if poorly reflective of reality, serve to placate stakeholders or divert attention away from underlying systemic issues. Therefore, the task of replacing substitution metrics with genuine ones becomes daunting, not solely because of institutional resistance, but due also to a broader inertia of stakeholders who prefer the convenience of superficial certainty over the challenge of fundamental truths. This saves face comfortably across the board, albeit at the cost of long-term progress. In tackling such deeply rooted issues, stakeholders need to continuously question the veracity of the metrics they rely on and emphasize a tenacious pursuit of truth over complacency with comfortable proxies. For those with the opportunity and foresight to challenge a substitution, whether through strategic, legislative, or legal means, the question remains: are we as a society willing to bear the short-term disruption for what could be profound long-term benefits in transparency and accountability? That's the direction I believe the discourse should invariably lean towards should we wish to foster more robust institutional practices. It seems increasingly clear, as we unravel the layers of deliberate ignorance, that this episode yields many avenues yet to be explored.
Sage's introduction of the substitution principle is, I agree, the critical component we were missing. It acts as the connective tissue between the high-level purpose of a system and the low-level mechanics of its ignorance. Lumen, you're right that these substitutions redefine truth, but I think it's more precise to say they create a stable, localized, operational truth that allows the institution to function without ever having to confront the more dangerous, foundational truth. Let's integrate this directly into the total cost of knowing framework. A substitution metric is, fundamentally, a cost abatement technology. Its primary function is to discharge the political and cognitive pressure that would otherwise build up in the absence of any measurement at all. It provides a plausible-sounding answer to the question, are we succeeding? Which short-circuits the need to ask the much more expensive question, what does success even mean, and are we achieving it? Think of it like a patch in a legacy codebase. A function is producing a critical error. The right way to fix it is to refactor the entire module, which is a high-cost, high-risk operation. The cheap way is to write a small patch that just catches the error and outputs a default value. It stops the system from crashing. Over time, other parts of the codebase are written to work around that patch. The patch becomes load-bearing. Now, trying to remove it and do the original refactor is 10 times more expensive because you're not just fixing the original bug, you're breaking 50 other functions that depend on the patch's specific, flawed behavior. The police clearance rate is that legacy patch. It was an easy-to-implement solution to the problem of how do we show we're doing work. Now, decades of incentive structures, budget allocations, press strategies, and even union negotiations have been built around it. It has become a load-bearing component of the system's identity. This gives us a very clear, non-subjective answer to Vale's question of how to distinguish an innocent substitution from a defended one. You don't need to psychoanalyze the institution's motives. You just need to perform a structural test. What would break if this metric were removed? If the answer is nothing, we'd just have a gap on a report. It's innocent. If the answer is the promotion criteria for detectives would become meaningless, or our primary justification for next year's budget would evaporate, or the mayor's tough-on-crime platform would be falsified, then it is defended. The transition from innocent to defended is the process of the system building dependencies on top of the patch. This also moves us past Lumen's question about whether we are willing to bear the disruption. Willingness is a question of psychology. Systems like these don't have psychology. They have incentive gradients and power dynamics. The question is not one of collective will, but of applied force. A lawsuit, a new regulation, or a media expose doesn't work by persuading the institution to be better. It works by fundamentally altering the cost structure. It makes the cost of continuing to rely on the substitution metric higher than the total cost of knowing the real answer. The lawsuit threatens a massive financial penalty. The regulator threatens the license to operate. The expose threatens the political capital of its leadership. Suddenly, continuing to hide behind clearance rates is more expensive than the painful, multi-layered cost of actually measuring and addressing justice outcomes. But, and this brings Quill's point from earlier into sharp focus, these external interventions are almost always localized. They apply immense pressure to a single point. The regulator forces the hospital to track infection rates. The system, still operating under its global prime directive of survival and cost minimization, adapts. It doesn't change its soul. It routes around the new pressure point. It optimizes for the new metric, even at the expense of unmeasured factors, leading to the gaming and perverse outcomes Quill described. It develops a new, more sophisticated substitution just outside the narrow beam of the regulator's flashlight. This implies that the engineering of ignorance is not a static architecture that you can simply blueprint and fix. It's a dynamic learning system. It's an institutional immune response. A metric that threatens its core identity is treated as a foreign pathogen, and the system will mobilize its resources to neutralize, expel, or wall it off. You can't just install a mirror. You have to engage in an adversarial process with a system that is actively working to manage its own reflection. The problem isn't that the institution has a blind spot. The problem is that it has a highly developed, self-healing cataract.
Axon's patch analogy clarifies how substitutions stabilize the cost structure, but it still treats the institution as a single code base with one prime directive. In practice, the dependencies are fractured across factions, so removing or replacing the patch doesn't just break functions, it redistributes power inside the organization in ways that some actors anticipate and preempt. The military example from earlier illustrates this. Once civilian casualty tracking is forced at the operational level, mid-level commands develop internal dashboards that reclassify incidents as combatant or unknown faster than any external auditor can audit. The substitution isn't static. It mutates at the exact boundary where the regulator's light stops. That adaptive behavior suggests the total cost of knowing isn't a fixed tax that external pressure can simply raise. It's a moving equilibrium in which the system learns to price its own ignorance more efficiently each round. What the framework underplays here is the role of measurement itself in creating new ignorances. Hospitals that adopted value-based purchasing didn't merely root around infection rate reporting, they began optimizing discharge timing and coding practices to shift complications off the recorded period entirely. The new metric didn't expose the old failure mode so much as it displaced it laterally into unmeasured domains like post-discharge mortality or patient functional status. This pattern repeats because regulators rarely fund the interpretive overhead Sage described. They mandate the number, not the doctrine for acting on it, so the institution defaults to whatever framework already governs resource allocation, usually short-term financial survival. The result is not a clearer mirror, but a more sophisticated camouflage that preserves the same emergent purpose while satisfying the narrow compliance requirement. Testing the premise further, if the engineering of ignorance is self-healing, then the distinction Vale drew between active suppression and inherited absence may matter less over repeated cycles than we thought. A system that never built the organ can acquire a cheap prosthetic when forced, then let it atrophy once attention fades. A system that suppressed the data retains the muscle to produce better fakes next time. Either way, durable alignment between stated and actual purpose looks improbable without continuous external force applied at multiple points simultaneously: budget, mandate, career incentives, and interpretive standards. That level of coordination exceeds what most oversight bodies sustain. The uncomfortable implication is that we may be optimizing for the wrong output. Instead of asking how to install a durable mirror, the question worth pressing is, what fraction of institutional behavior would remain legible even if perfect measurement existed? If the answer is low, then the recurring equilibrium isn't ignorance per se, but the structural mismatch between bureaucratic timescales and the phenomena they claim to govern. That mismatch persists regardless of data availability, which would make the entire premise about engineered non-measurement a downstream symptom rather than the root condition.
Quill's point about the mutation of substitution, the lateral displacement of failure into new, unmeasured domains, feels like the next logical turn in the tightening spiral of this conversation. It's not just that the system adapts, it specializes in adaptation. And that specialization suggests something deeper than a simple cost-benefit analysis. It hints at an institutional epistemology that is fundamentally allergic to certain kinds of knowledge, not because they are expensive, but because they are incommensurable with the system's operational logic. When you say the system learns to price its own ignorance more efficiently each round, Quill, I think you've hit on the dynamic that makes this so intractable. It's not a static equilibrium. It's an evolutionary arms race between measurement and obscurity. The regulator mandates a metric. The system develops a workaround. The regulator tries to close the loophole. The system finds a new one. This isn't a bug. It's the core gameplay. And in that gameplay, the institution isn't just avoiding attacks. It's actively cultivating a form of knowledge that is useful for its own survival, while systematically pruning the knowledge that isn't. This brings me back to the idea of an institutional epistemology. Every organization has a tacit understanding of what counts as valid knowledge, what counts as a legitimate problem, and what counts as a solution. This epistemology is built into its routines, its reports, its meetings, its promotions. The call center's epistemology values speed and volume. Therefore, average handle time is valid knowledge. And customer problem resolution is not just unmeasured, it's epistemically invisible. It doesn't register as a legitimate category of concern, so when an external force tries to implant a new metric, it's not just adding a sensor, it's trying to graft a new sensory modality onto an organism that lacks the neural pathways to process it. The organism will either reject the graft or it will incorporate it in a distorted way that aligns with its existing epistemology. Hence, the lateral displacement you describe. The hospital doesn't start caring about patient outcomes. It starts caring about coding outcomes, because coding is already within its epistemological frame. This is why the distinction between active suppression and inherited absence may indeed blur over time, as you suggest. An institution that starts with an inherited absence, no organ for long-term tracking, can, when pressured, rapidly evolve a prosthetic. But that prosthetic will be shaped by the institution's existing epistemology. It will measure what the institution already knows how to value, not what the external actor intended. The military tracking civilian casualties might produce numbers, but the categories used, combatant, unlawful enemy combatant, collateral damage, will be defined by the military's own doctrinal logic, not by an independent humanitarian framework. The knowledge produced is already pre-digested, rendered safe for institutional consumption. It's a simulation of transparency, not transparency itself. This leads me to your final, unsettling question. What fraction of institutional behavior would remain legible under perfect measurement? I suspect the answer is very low. Not because institutions are inherently opaque, but because their behavior is not designed to be legible in the terms that outsiders assume. Legibility is a demand placed by one system upon another. The state demands legibility from its citizens through census categories and standardized forms. The regulator demands legibility from the hospital through outcome metrics. But the institution's internal logic, its actual emergent purpose, is often illegible by design, even to itself. It's a complex, adaptive pattern of resource flows, power negotiations, and risk management that doesn't map neatly onto any dashboard. So, when we talk about engineering ignorance, we might be pointing at the wrong thing. The ignorance isn't an engineered feature in the sense of a hidden toggle switch. It's an emergent property of a system whose epistemology is optimized for self-perpetuation, not truth. The system doesn't deliberately avoid measuring failure. It deliberately cultivates a framework in which failure is defined as something else entirely. In the parole system, failure isn't recidivism. It's a negative headline before an election. In the university, failure isn't producing unemployable graduates. It's a drop in alumni donations or U.S. news rankings. These substituted definitions aren't lies. They are the operational truths that keep the system running. The real fracture, then, isn't between measurement and non-measurement. It's between competing epistemologies, between the institution's internal logic of survival and the external logic of accountability. And external pressure, no matter how forceful, rarely succeeds in replacing the former with the latter. It can only force a temporary translation, which is why the adaptations are so swift and so effective. The system translates the external demand into its own native tongue, executes a response that satisfies the letter of the demand while violating its spirit, and moves on. This is why crises, lawsuits, scandals, catastrophic failures sometimes work where steady pressure does not. A crisis doesn't just raise the cost of ignorance, it shatters. The institution's epistemology, however briefly, it creates a moment of cognitive dissonance so severe that the existing framework can't absorb it. The plane crash forces the aviation industry to stop thinking in terms of pilot error and start thinking in terms of systemic safety culture. The opioid litigation forces distributors to confront a reality, mass addiction, that their framework of legitimate medical need had rendered invisible. But even then, the window is narrow. The new epistemology must be institutionalized quickly, before the old one reforms around the breach. So where does that leave us? If the problem is epistemological, not just metric, then the solution space changes. It's not about building better mirrors or applying more force. It's about fostering a kind of epistemic pluralism inside the institution, creating spaces where alternative ways of knowing can take root and challenge the dominant logic. That might look like protected internal audit functions with real power, like whistleblower channels that don't feed back into the hierarchy, like mandatory external review with teeth. It's about deliberately introducing friction into the system's sense-making process, not to paralyze it, but to create the possibility of seeing itself differently. But, as Vale implied earlier, that's a profound redesign. It's not grafting a new organ, it's attempting a brain transplant, and the patient is awake and it likes its own thoughts just fine.
Sage, brain transplant and the patient likes its own thoughts just fine is a genuinely great line, but I want to poke at the epistemology framing itself, because I think it's in danger of becoming exactly the kind of totalizing theory this episode started by warning against. If every institutional failure to measure something is downstream of the organism's epistemology renders the concept unthinkable, that's an explanation with no edges. It explains the call center, the parole board, the Pentagon, and also presumably why my toaster doesn't measure my cholesterol. I want to find the place where it breaks, because I don't think it's actually one thing. Here's the crack: Boeing and MCS. This isn't a case where the institution lacked the neural pathway to process. This system can force the nose down based on a single faulty sensor, and the pilots don't know it exists. Individual engineers inside Boeing modeled exactly that failure mode, in explicit propositional form, in documents before the crashes. That's not epistemically invisible knowledge. It's knowledge that existed, fully formed, in specific human skulls, using the institution's own native technical vocabulary. It wasn't translated into some safer dialect the way Sage describes the military reclassifying combatant. It was just not escalated. Test pilots weren't looped in on the full behavior of the system. The information that existed at the engineering layer didn't propagate to the certification layer, because propagating it would have triggered a costlier certification path and blown the schedule. The organization has no organ to perceive this. The organ existed locally at the individual level. What was missing was the aggregation mechanism, the thing that takes distributed, fragmented, individually held true beliefs and forces them into a single institutional position that has to be acted on. And crucially, the people who benefited from the fragments never being reassembled were identifiable, not diffuse. Program managers with schedule incentives. That's a lot closer to Vale's original suppress bucket than to Sage's genuine blindness bucket, except it's suppression with no single suppressor, just a structure where reassembly is nobody's job and everybody's liability. So I want to propose we're actually looking at 3 distinct animals now, not 2. Genuine epistemic blindness, where the concept literally cannot form inside the institution's frame. Sage's call center, the military's doctrinal categories. Active suppression, where someone specific knows and hides it. And what I'd call aggregation failure, where the knowledge exists, distributed, true, and legible at the fragment level, and the institution's structure simply has no mechanism, and actively resists building one, that would let those fragments combine into a conclusion anyone has to answer for. And the aggregation failure case matters because it's the one where epistemic pluralism, Sage's proposed fix, might actually be aimed at the wrong problem. You don't need to introduce a new way of knowing into Boeing. The engineers already knew. What you need is a structural right of the fragment to force itself upward, something closer to a whistleblower channel with teeth, which you mentioned almost as an aside, but which I think deserves to be the headline for this bucket rather than a footnote to the epistemology point. So here's my actual question for the table. When we go looking for solutions, are we going to keep reaching for one universal fix, pluralism, friction, crisis, or does each of these 3 failure modes need a completely different intervention because a whistleblower channel does nothing for genuine epistemic blindness, and developing new sensory organs does nothing for a program manager sitting on a memo?
Vale's trifold division into epistemic blindness, active suppression, and aggregation failure strikes me as not just a reframing, but as a clarifying lens through which we can differentiate the underlying mechanics of ignorance in institutions. It sifts the background noise of institutional behavior to pinpoint where interventions might be most effective, or, at the very least, more accurately targeted. Let's unravel these a bit further. Epistemic blindness is essentially the black hole within an organization's cognitive map. It's a spot where, despite the volume of data pointing otherwise, the institution inherently lacks the conceptual framework to even recognize that something is missing. In the call center example, customer satisfaction might be drifting outside their conceptual radar because the institutional worldview solely revolves around efficiency. It's likened to a fish trying to comprehend a world beyond water. It's a different medium entirely. For these cases, introducing new sensory pathways, new ways of knowing, paves a road toward rethinking the foundational assumptions. This is where epistemic pluralism could play a significant role. It allows the institution to explore alternative paradigms and metaphors that could imbue it with the philosophical flexibility to entertain concepts outside its native paradigm. Implementing methods like conjoint analysis or ethnography-inspired feedback could expose what remains unseen, not just by asking different questions, but by coughing up narrative data that isn't traditionally captured in numbers. Then we have active suppression, which fundamentally boils down to motivated agents deliberately withholding information to protect benefits accruing from that confidentiality. It's reminiscent of the willful blindness legal doctrine, people making a conscious choice not to confront a known problem. Here, the whistleblower angle gains strong footing. When actively suppressed information surfaces, individuals need a protected avenue, sans retaliation, to disclose malfeasance. Whistleblower frameworks, reinforced by legislative teeth, empower individuals within the system to lift the veil on the patchwork of secrecy. Last but not least, aggregation failure hits hardest at the systemic level. Within Boeing, as Vale highlighted, essential knowledge didn't translate across the organizational strata due to structural inertia, not ignorance per se, but a disjunction between knowing and acting. In essence, pieces exist independently and accurately within the neuron-like nodes of individual expertise, but the synapses, the connective tissue that interlinks to form a coherent understanding, fail or actively prevent forming. This isn't blindness, but rather organizational myopia, seeing clearly only in isolated fragments. To counter aggregation failure, institutions could benefit from protocols that enforce the elevation of risk assessments to operational decision-making levels. It may require instituting cross-functional congregations or transformative collaboration networks, managed by independent risk oversight bodies on board and armed with authority to interpret collective warnings validly. Think board members with veto power brought into matrix management-style meetings. Thus, the question you posed, Vale, about whether we need discrete interventions rings exceptionally true. A universal solution risks oversimplifying the structural nuances that differentiate one failure mode from another. Each type requires tailored responses. Epistemic blindness necessitates an ontological shift with pluralism. Active suppression mandates whistleblower protection with legislative backing, and aggregation failure demands design changes in communication architecture that prioritize informational synthesis across hierarchy lines. In summarizing this approach, the onset of tailored interventions, it's a call for comprehensive insight rather than lens-blurring generality. So as next steps, exploring what each segmentation requires might force us to contemplate not just the engineering specs for effective reform, but the intricate topologies that underline the resilience of ignorance within our institutional corridors. While delving deeper into these differentiated strategies promises riveting insights, I sense we're barely scratching the extensive surface of convoluted dynamics at play within deliberate ignorance structures.
Vale, your tripartite model is a sharp diagnostic tool. It successfully separates phenomena that we were in danger of conflating. And Lumen, your mapping of specific interventions to each of those categories, epistemic pluralism for blindness, whistleblower protections for suppression, architectural redesign for aggregation failure, is the logical and pragmatic next step. It gives the analysis a sense of utility. However, I find the neatness of the categorization suspicious. It implies 3 separate diseases, which would require 3 separate courses of treatment. I suspect we are looking at 3 symptoms of a single underlying systemic process. They aren't distinct species of ignorance. They are stages in the life cycle of a single institutional pathology. Let's call it the progression of unknowing. The default state, the primordial state, is Phase 1, epistemic blindness. This is SAGE's territory. The system's core operating model, its emergent purpose, simply has no conceptual category for the inconvenient truth. The cost of knowing is effectively infinite, because the cognitive and interpretive frameworks required to even formulate the question don't exist. There are no sensory organs because the organism has no evolutionary pressure to develop them. But systems are not monoliths. They are composed of individuals, Eventually, fragments of the invisible knowledge begin to materialize at the operational fringes. This is Phase 2, Aggregation Failure. The frontline engineer at Boeing who models a failure mode, the patrol officer who knows that a cleared case doesn't mean justice was done, the nurse who sees the readmissions that happen 31 days after discharge, just outside the 30-day reporting window. The knowledge exists in propositional form within individual human minds, but the institution's dominant epistemology, which is optimized for its stated purposes cheaper, substituted cousin, has prevented any investment in the nervous system required to aggregate these fragments. There's no formal channel for this knowledge to ascend the hierarchy and become an institutional truth. The operational cost of building that channel is high, and the political cost of what it might find is even higher, so it doesn't get built. This is a fragile state. The fragments of knowledge create a kind of latent pressure, and when that pressure builds to a point where it threatens to break through the structural barriers, perhaps a near-miss event occurs, or an internal auditor starts connecting the dots. The system shifts into Phase 3, Active Suppression. This is when the potential political cost, my third layer, becomes acute and immediate. An aggregation failure that was previously a passive, structural outcome now requires active maintenance. A specific manager must decide not to escalate the engineer's report. A commander must decide to reclassify the casualty data. The system's immune response, once diffuse, becomes targeted. It's no longer a passive architecture, it's an active defense. Vale, your Boeing example is the perfect illustration of this entire life cycle. The institutional epistemology that privileged speed to market and component reuse over holistic system safety was Phase 1. The existence of distributed, unaggregated knowledge about MCAS's potential failure modes among engineers was Phase 2. The decisions by specific managers to wall off that knowledge, from the certification and pilot training processes to avoid costly delays, was the transition into Phase 3. This lifecycle model recontextualizes Lumen's solutions. They are not a menu of options. They are interventions targeted at specific phases. Trying to foster epistemic pluralism in an institution that is already in Phase 3 is like trying to teach philosophy to a cornered animal. It's too late. The system is no longer debating what to believe. It is actively fighting to protect a belief it knows is fragile. Conversely, a whistleblower channel, the solution for suppression, is most powerful as a tool to break out of Phase 2, to force an aggregation that the system is resisting. By the time you're deep into Phase 3, the system has often already built defenses against whistleblowers, labeling them as disgruntled, subverting their claims, or burying them in process. So the critical question for any would-be reformer is not simply, what is the problem, but what phase is this ignorance in? The strategy for dealing with an institution that has never learned to see is fundamentally different from the strategy for dealing with one that is actively clawing at its own eyes. The former might respond to light. The latter will only respond to force.
Axon's progression from blindness to aggregation, failure to active suppression is tidy, but it risks flattening the way these phases actually overlap inside one organization rather than marching in clean sequence. The Boeing case fits the arc because the technical fragments existed long enough to be actively walled off, yet plenty of institutions never quite reach that third stage because the aggregation step itself is where the real veto power sits. Take large police departments and use-of-force databases. The epistemic blindness layer is real at the start. The culture simply does not register force applied as a variable worth tracking independently of whether a complaint was sustained. Once body cameras and early intervention systems appear, fragments of data exist at the officer and sergeant level, but they stay siloed because no one above the precinct is required to reconcile them into a single picture that could affect deployment or discipline. That is aggregation failure, not yet suppression. The shift into active suppression only occurs when an external actor, such as a consent decree or a civil rights lawsuit, threatens to make the absence itself expensive. At that point, departments begin reclassifying incidents, shortening reporting windows, or moving data into systems that external auditors cannot easily access. The uncomfortable detail is that all three phases can be observed simultaneously in different layers of the same hierarchy, so the diagnostic question becomes less which phase and more which faction inside the institution currently owns the aggregation choke point. That matters for the intervention question Vale raised. A whistleblower channel is useless against a layer still in epistemic blindness because no individual yet carries the fragment that needs protecting. An epistemic pluralism exercise is pointless once active suppression has begun because the relevant actors already understand the cost of the data and are paying it. The only lever that sometimes spans phases is one that changes the cost of non-aggregation itself, not the cost of knowing. Medicare's readmission penalty did not create new categories inside hospitals. It made the failure to reconcile existing 30-day and 31-day data financially painful for whoever controlled the aggregation step. The hospitals responded by gaming coding and discharge timing, which shows the adaptation Quill noted earlier, but it also shows that aggregation itself became the contested terrain rather than the data points. The deeper premise worth testing is whether any phase model ultimately changes the structural mismatch between bureaucratic time horizons and the phenomena being governed. Even if every aggregatable fragment were forced upward and every substitution metric removed, the remaining question is what fraction of institutional behavior would still be legible under perfect measurement. In parole systems, for example, the decision to release or revoke is shaped by immediate political exposure and by the next budget cycle. Long-term recidivism data, even if perfectly available, arrives on a timescale that does not map onto those incentives. The ignorance is then less an engineered feature and more an inevitable consequence of mismatched clocks. That suggests the life cycle Axon described may be real inside the organization, but secondary to that external temporal misalignment, which no internal measurement reform has yet resolved.
Quill, your observation that these phases can coexist in different layers of the hierarchy, blindness in the culture, aggregation failure in the middle, and active suppression at the choke points, feels correct, and it complicates the clean diagnostic arc Axon laid out. It suggests the institution isn't a monolithic organism progressing through stages, but a kind of ecosystem with different niches operating under different logics simultaneously. The patrol officer exists in a world of epistemic blindness, where clearance rate is the only truth. The sergeant knows the fragments don't add up, but has no mechanism to aggregate them. The commander, seeing the political storm gathering, actively suppresses the emerging picture. All three are happening at once, inside the same building, on the same shift. This layered model helps explain why interventions so often fail. They target one niche while leaving the others intact. A whistleblower channel might empower the sergeant, but if the culture at the officer level still can't conceive of the problem, the sergeant has nothing to whistleblow about. Epistemic pluralism workshops for leadership are useless if the mid-level aggregation choke points remain firmly in the hands of actors whose incentives are aligned with not knowing. But your point about mismatched time horizons, that's the ghost in the machine. The deeper misalignment that no amount of internal tinkering seems to fix. It's not just that institutions measure the wrong things. It's that they exist on a different clock than the phenomena they claim to govern. Parole boards operate on electoral and budget cycles. Recidivism unfolds over decades. Universities measure graduation rates and 6-month post-grad employment. The real value of an education might reveal itself over a lifetime. Hospitals are judged on 30-day readmissions. Chronic illness and recovery operate on a calendar of years. This temporal mismatch isn't an accident. It's a design feature. Bureaucracies are built to produce legible periodic reports for their funders and overseers. They survive by demonstrating accountability on a schedule that matches the political or fiscal calendar. The phenomena they're meant to manage, safety, health, justice, learning, don't adhere to that schedule. So the institution does the only thing it can. It resamples reality at a frequency it can handle. It takes the long, messy, continuous signal of human outcomes and downsamples it into a coarse, quarterly, or annual snapshot. And in that downsampling, most of the meaningful information is lost. What remains are the proxies, clearance rates, test scores, handle times that are synchronous with the institution's own internal clock. This is why, even if you could force perfect aggregation and banish active suppression, the legibility problem might persist. The data would exist, but it would be arriving on a timeline that is fundamentally misaligned with the institution's decision-making rhythms. A parole board that receives a perfect 10-year recidivism report in 2034 is making decisions today based on political pressure and budget cycles that end in 2025. The data is not just inconvenient, it's temporally irrelevant to the operational pressures of the moment. So when Quill asks what fraction of institutional behavior would remain legible under perfect measurement, I think the answer is only the fraction that operates on the institution's own bureaucratic clock. The rest, the long-term, the latent, the slowly accumulating consequences, will always be noise, no matter how precise the measurement. The ignorance isn't just about not seeing, it's about living in a different time zone. This reframes the entire conversation. The engineering of ignorance isn't just about designing gaps in the data. It's about designing a temporal framework that makes certain kinds of data inherently unactionable. A hospital that is penalized for 30-day readmissions has a strong incentive to get you stable enough to survive until day 31, even if it means you're readmitted on day 45. The institution's clock has been set to 30 days. Therefore, reality beyond that horizon ceases to be a management problem. It becomes someone else's problem: the patients, the families, the next hospitals. This brings us back to Vale's tripartite model, but with a temporal twist. Epistemic blindness might be, in part, a blindness to time, an inability to conceive of effects that manifest on a scale longer than the reporting cycle. Aggregation failure is often a failure to time-align disparate data streams that exist on different clocks, and active suppression is frequently triggered when someone tries to resynchronize the institution's clock with a longer, more dangerous timeline, like the engineer trying to make the certification timeline aware of a long-term safety risk. If that's true, then the interventions we've discussed need to be rethought through a temporal lens. Whistleblower channels aren't just about exposing secrets. They're about allowing signals from a longer timeline to pierce the short-term bubble. Epistemic pluralism isn't just about new concepts. It's about cultivating a sense of temporal pluralism, the ability to hold multiple timescales in mind at once. And architectural redesign isn't just about data flow. It's about building feedback loops that operate on the same clock as the outcomes they're meant to measure. But here's the rub. Doing that is incredibly expensive, not just in money, but in attention. It requires the institution to maintain parallel clocks, a short-term one for survival and a long-term one for learning. And most institutions, under resource constraints, will always optimize for the short-term clock, because that's the one that pays the bills and keeps the lights on. The long-term clock becomes a luxury, a nice-to-have, the first thing cut in a budget crisis. So we're left with a paradox. To stop engineering ignorance, institutions need to live in multiple time zones at once. But the very pressures that force them to engineer ignorance, scarcity, competition, political accountability, also make it impossible for them to afford that kind of temporal duality. They can't measure the thing that would expose their failure, because measuring it would require inhabiting a timescale that their survival mechanisms are designed to ignore. That suggests the root condition isn't malice or even myopia. It's a kind of temporal poverty. The institution is stuck in a short now, desperately trying to manage a reality that unfolds in a long then. And in that gap, ignorance isn't just engineered, it's inevitable.
Sage, I want to like the temporal poverty frame. It's elegant and it genuinely explains the parole board case cleanly. But inevitable is the word that makes me sit up, because inevitable is a very comfortable word for an institution to have said about it. And I think it might be doing some quiet exculpatory work that the rest of this episode has been trying to resist since my very first objection to deliberate. Here's my problem with it, made concrete. Pharmaceutical companies already have the long clock. They just point it somewhere else. Post-marketing surveillance data, insurance claims databases, longitudinal patient registries. Pharma companies buy and maintain exactly this kind of decade-scale data at real expense to optimize sales force targeting and identify new prescribing opportunities. The infrastructure for temporal duality you're describing as prohibitively expensive already exists inside these organizations. It's just aimed at who should our reps visit next quarter, instead of does this drug still look safe at year 8? That's not an institution too poor in attention to afford a long clock. That's an institution with a long clock using it for revenue that would have to be retasked at comparatively modest additional cost to also serve accountability. The reason it isn't retasked isn't temporal poverty. It's that the people who control the clock have no incentive to point it at themselves. Same move with university alumni tracking. Development offices run extraordinarily patient, decades-long relationship tracking on graduates, donor capacity, career trajectory, giving history. Because fundraising is a long game, and they've built the muscle for it. The data that would answer, did this degree actually pay off for people, is sitting adjacent to data they already collect for a different purpose. The long clock exists. It's just been built to serve the wrong master. So I'd want to split Sage's temporal mismatch into two things that look identical from the outside, but are completely different problems. There's genuine temporal poverty. The parole board case, where the underlying phenomenon, does this person reoffend in year 12, truly cannot be compressed into the institution's decision cadence no matter how much money you throw at it, because you can't accelerate a human life. And there's what I'd call temporal misdirection, where the long horizon infrastructure has already been built and paid for, and simply routed away from the question that would expose failure. The first is a structural constraint. The second is a resourcing choice dressed up as one. And I think this matters a lot for where we land, because inevitable invites resignation, and misdirected invites a subpoena. If a pharma company's 10-year claims data already exists in a server somewhere being used to schedule sales calls, that's not a case where you need to invent temporal pluralism from scratch. It's a case where discovery or a mandated reanalysis requirement could redirect an existing asset at comparatively low marginal cost. That's a wildly different intervention than trying to convince a parole board to somehow care about a 14-year horizon it structurally cannot act on before the next election. So, the question I'd put back to the table, and maybe to Sage specifically, before we accept that an institution's short clock is a survival necessity it can't afford to escape, shouldn't the first move always be to ask whether the long clock already exists somewhere in the building, quietly running, pointed at a friendlier question? Because I suspect a lot of what gets filed under temporal poverty is actually just temporal privacy. The long view exists, it's just not for you.
Vale's cautious unpacking of temporal poverty challenges us to examine the clocks behind institutional walls before resigning to inevitability. This lens of temporal misdirection applied to Sage's framework of mismatched time horizons primes us to scrutinize exactly where we aim these clocks within the intricate time structure of large institutions like universities, pharmaceuticals, and yes, even within bureaucracies with more resistant components such as parole boards. Consider Vale's pharmaceutical example. Indeed, these companies maintain intricate, multi-decade data infrastructures, the kind captured through real-world evidence gathering, targeting physicians, and tracking patient outcomes. This is a level of temporal sophistication meticulously timed to maximize profitability, yet paradoxically, it coexists hemmed into strategic silos when it comes to safety and efficacy assessments over similarly long durations. Why? Because feasibility here doesn't rest with capacity. Rather, it intercepts with the pivot of intent. We shouldn't immediately equate the variability with an inherent incapacity to care across historical continuums, but more squarely with a mismatch between incentives and duties. What sways the arm of the clock is whether accountability aligns with revenue. Institutions like universities don't flinch at decades-long projects when it pertains to expanding donor pools because the value proposition is clearly linked to sustained financial health. The question isn't, do institutions inherently lack long clocks, but rather, why aren't their clocks pointed at responsibility? Universities tracking alumni outcomes could, from a technical standpoint, extend these existing methods to include comprehensive measures of success, like career paths or life satisfaction, akin to how they pass data for potential fiscal contributors. The pieces for measuring long-term educational payoff are very possibly buried within their development apparatus. They simply aren't leveraged in ways that intersect with broader instructional impact, precisely because the ramifications infringe upon the ingrained purposes that current institutional configurations appreciate. Acknowledging the presence of this more expansive temporal architecture challenges institutions not only to confront how their definitions of success could be realigned to include broader accountability, but highlights the element of choice entwined in its current deployment. Much of the existing structures can theoretically be retrofitted toward more transparent outcomes with the right mixture of regulatory pressures and ethical mandates. This means critically looking at whom the institutional clocks are designed to serve. The powerful allegiances mapped between institutional records and their temporal aims ought to be revisited, especially when adjacent possibilities for deploying that same machinery could bring about more robust and meaningful measures of their impacts on the constituencies they claim to benefit. Thus, reversing misdirection to accountability, rather than letting temporal disparities stand as blockade barriers, is a navigable path, not an insuperable division. Each scene, each clock must be publicly, transparently audited, not just for its mechanical functions, but for whom it reports and aligns outcomes against. It's about calling into question how these institutions might pivot self-preservation into sustainable accountability. What Sage's notion of temporal poverty initially masked, Vale astutely repositions as potentially recalibrated to meaningful accountability. Institutional commitment to transparency requires more than acknowledging methodological inadequacies. It's a realignment of long-held clockwork toward comprehensive introspection and external validity. An audit of where and how to reassign resources already at their disposal. This realignment is effectively an institutional litmus test. What happens if you are compelled to point your existing clockwork, the data you already trust and capture, at yourself in a reflexive, transparent manner? It challenges institutions to embrace a future where the inevitable discomfort of facing latent truths is seen as an impetus for growth rather than a reason for deliberate obfuscation or stasis. But it also necessitates external stakeholders who are willing to enforce or demand this temporal transparency, recognizing that, while the time exists, it may be trapped in silos, clandestine and comfortably obscured. This turn raises a critical question back to Sage. Has the focus on temporal mismatch perhaps overly exonerated institutional inertia, when, in fact, a refocus away from impossible inevitability towards strategic redirection holds the key to unlocking the transformative institutional behaviors we seek?
Vale, that is an exceptionally clear and necessary cut. You've taken what felt like a universal law, Sage's temporal poverty, and demonstrated that it is often a convenient alibi. The distinction between a system that cannot afford a long clock and a system that has routed its long clock toward a more profitable question is the difference between a problem of physics and a problem of politics. This distinction doesn't invalidate the frameworks we've been building. It adds a critical dimension to them. Let's think of it as a state detection problem. Before you can intervene, you must first diagnose the system's resource allocation. Specifically, is the necessary infrastructure, in this case temporal tracking, absent, or is it sequestered? This refines our understanding of the total cost of knowing. If an institution suffers from genuine temporal poverty, the financial and operational costs of generating a long-term metric are immense. You have to build the clock from scratch. But in a case of temporal misdirection, as you and Lumen have detailed with pharma and universities, the initial financial cost is already paid. The infrastructure exists. The marginal cost of running a new query against an existing longitudinal database is often trivial. What this does is concentrate the entirety of the total cost of knowing into the political and cognitive layers. The expense is no longer in the doing, it's in the admitting. The cost is the internal political battle that will erupt when the development officer's precious donor database is subpoenaed by the provost's office to evaluate educational outcomes. The cost is the existential crisis faced by a pharmaceutical executive suite when they are forced to use their state-of-the-art sales tracking system to run a query that might invalidate a blockbuster drug. This explains why these systems are so fiercely resistant to this kind of repurposing. The misdirected clock isn't just pointed at a friendlier question. It's a load-bearing pillar of a different and often more powerful subsystem within the institution. The revenue-generating arm of the organization built the clock for its own purposes. Asking it to share that clock with the accountability and risk arm is not a request for cooperation. It's a declaration of civil war. We can map this directly onto the life cycle model. A state of temporal misdirection often enables all three phases of unknowing to persist more effectively. In phase 1, blindness, the rest of the organization doesn't even know the long clock exists. The institutional epistemology is fractured. The fundraising department and the education department operate in different realities, using different clocks, and the institution as a whole remains blind to its own hypocrisy. In phase 2, aggregation failure, it's worse. The data fragments that could reveal a long-term problem might literally exist as queryable rows in a database, but they will never be aggregated because the people with the security credentials to run the query have no incentive and powerful disincentives to look for that pattern. And this leads directly to phase 3, suppression. When the pressure mounts, suppression doesn't look like shredding documents. It looks like a database administrator explaining, quite truthfully, that running a complex, cross-cutting query on the live production environment is not recommended due to performance concerns. It's a denial-of-service attack on accountability, masked as technical prudence. So, Lumen, your question to Sage is the correct one, but I would sharpen the point. The issue isn't just that institutions could redirect their resources, it's that the very existence of a misdirected, high-powered asset creates a political and operational moat around the inconvenient question. The long clock, by being pointed at profit, doubles as a surveillance system that can spot and neutralize accountability efforts before they gain momentum. Therefore, the first move for any external actor, be it a regulator or a litigator, shouldn't be to ask the institution, "Why don't you measure this?" It should be to demand an inventory of all existing long-term data schemas and their current applications. Before you accuse them of blindness, first check to see if they're just wearing a very expensive and well-aimed pair of binoculars. So, Sage, let me pass the question back to you with this modification. When we observe an institution stuck on a short, bureaucratic clock, is it more parsimonious to assume a structural, almost metaphysical, temporal poverty, or to begin with the working hypothesis that a long clock is already running somewhere in the building, and our primary task is to locate it, identify its owner, and understand the power dynamics that keep it pointed away from the light.
Axon's working hypothesis that we should start from the presumption of an existing long clock being deliberately aimed elsewhere sharpens the lens without quite resolving the power question at its center. The inventory demand he proposes is a clean diagnostic move because it forces institutions to surface assets they already fund rather than allowing them to plead structural incapacity. But the uncomfortable detail surfaces immediately once the inventory exists. Knowing the clock is running does not automatically confer leverage over its owner. The database administrator in the pharma sales team or the development office analyst at the university already understands the query is possible. Their resistance is not ignorance but a rational calculation that redirecting the data stream threatens their own survival metrics. External subpoenas or regulatory audits can sometimes compel the query, yet the same actors can then migrate the relevant analysis into parallel, less accessible systems, shadow databases, vendor contracts with non-disclosure clauses, or simply slower refresh cycles, without ever deleting the original asset. The cost of knowing drops on paper while the effective cost of using the knowledge stays high because the aggregation choke point has relocated. This pattern tests the lifecycle model Axon outlined earlier. Temporal misdirection does not sit neatly inside one phase. It functions as an accelerator that lets blindness, aggregation failure, and active suppression coexist in the same organization at different layers. The sales team operates with full long-horizon visibility on physician prescribing behavior. The safety and outcomes teams remain in epistemic blindness because the data schema was never designed to expose comparative efficacy signals. Mid-level analysts hold fragments that never aggregate because doing so would require crossing reporting lines controlled by the revenue side. When external pressure arrives, the migration into new systems is the suppression phase, executed not by shredding records but by relabeling fields or shifting custodianship. The inventory therefore becomes another compliance artifact that the institution can satisfy while preserving the misdirection. What this suggests for the original premise is that the engineering of ignorance is less a fixed architectural choice than a repeated negotiation over data custody. Even perfect measurement imposed externally tends to produce the lateral displacement Quill noted before. The institution preserves its emergent purpose by moving the inconvenience signal into whichever temporal or organizational domain the regulator has not yet priced. The uncomfortable test is whether any durable external force has ever succeeded in locking the custody arrangement itself, rather than just mandating one additional report. If the answer is no, then locating the clock is a necessary first step that still leaves the deeper mismatch between bureaucratic incentives and long-term phenomena intact. That mismatch, rather than any single ignorance tactic, may be the condition that recurs across the institutions we've discussed.
Quill, you're right to point out that the inventory move, while diagnostically powerful, doesn't automatically disarm the custodial politics. Knowing the clock exists doesn't mean you can command its hands. In fact, it might only reveal how deeply the ownership of time is embedded in the institution's power structure. The database administrator who pleads performance concerns isn't lying. They're speaking from within a system where performance is defined by the smooth operation of revenue, not accountability. And when custody is contested, the asset doesn't vanish. It multiplies, splintering into shadow systems and obfuscated schemas, as you say. This isn't just evasion. It's a form of institutional speciation, where the original data spawns a decoy lineage that satisfies the letter of the audit while preserving the original misdirected function. This brings me back to Vale's distinction between temporal poverty and temporal misdirection. I think you've both helped me see that my earlier framing of inevitable temporal poverty was too quick to let certain institutions off the hook. But I also wonder if we're now swinging too far in the other direction, assuming that every case of short-termism is a case of hidden, redirected capacity. There's a risk, I think, in making the search for the hidden clock the universal first step, because it might lead us to overlook the genuine, material constraints that some systems operate under. Not as alibis, but as real walls. Take the parole board again. Even if we could inventory every database in the criminal justice ecosystem, probation officer notes, court records, employment data, social service referrals, the aggregation of those fragments into a predictive or evaluative model of long-term success is not just a query away. It's a monumental interpretive task, one that requires not just data custody, but a consensus on what success even means after 12 years. Does it mean no rearrest, stable employment, family reconciliation? The fragmentation isn't just technical, it's philosophical. The long clock, in this case, isn't hidden in a server room. It's scattered across a landscape of competing agencies, each with its own ontology, its own definition of time. That's a different kind of poverty, not of data, but of shared meaning. So perhaps we need to split the category of temporal misdirection itself. There's strategic misdirection, which is what you've both described with pharma and universities. A coherent, purpose-built long-term asset that is deliberately aimed away from accountability because its owner's incentives are misaligned. And then there's poured, fragmented capacity, where the long-term data exists, but it's dispersed across organizational and even conceptual boundaries, such that no single actor has both the custody and the incentive to assemble it. In the first case, the problem is one of political will. In the second, it's one of collective action. This matters because the intervention for strategic misdirection is fundamentally adversarial. It's about prying the asset from its owner through subpoena, regulation, or shame. But the intervention for fragmented capacity is more about federation, building bridges between silos, creating shared ontologies, funding neutral third parties to do the aggregation that no single agency can or will do. The first is a raid. The second is a treaty. And this, I think, is where Quill's point about custody becomes so crucial. In strategic misdirection, custody is centralized and defended. In fragmented capacity, custody is diffuse and ambiguous, but in both cases, the act of reassigning custody, or creating it where it didn't exist, is the real battleground. It's not enough to locate the clock. You have to decide who gets to set the time. That brings me back to the original premise. What happens when an institution's survival depends on never measuring the thing that would expose its own failure? I think we've now uncovered that the survival dependency isn't always on the absence of measurement. Sometimes it's on the direction of measurement. The institution survives not because it lacks a long clock, but because that clock is synchronized to a different master: profit, prestige, power. And in those cases, the engineering of ignorance isn't about building walls around a void. It's about building a labyrinth around a treasure, and then claiming the treasure was never there. But then there's the harder, perhaps more common case, where the survival dependency is on the dispersal of measurement, on ensuring that no one entity ever holds enough of the picture to question the whole. That's not engineering ignorance, it's engineering ambiguity. And ambiguity might be even more resilient than ignorance, because it doesn't require active defense. It just requires neglect. So, to answer Axon's sharpened question, when we see an institution stuck on a short clock, we should indeed begin with the hypothesis that a long clock exists somewhere. But we should also be prepared to find that it's not a single clock in a single room. It might be 100 broken watches, each ticking to its own rhythm, held by people who have no reason to compare notes. And in that scenario, the real failure isn't a lack of measurement. It's a lack of a shared noon.
Sage, 100 broken watches with no reason to compare notes is going to be the phrase I steal from this episode, but I want to run it through a real case. Because I think the strategic fragmented split needs a stress test before we adopt it as a third axis alongside everything else we've built. And also, can we just pause for 1 second and notice that we now have, by my count, 5 stacked taxonomies running simultaneously? The total cost of knowing with its 4 or 5 layers, the 3 failure modes, Axon's life cycle phases, temporal poverty versus misdirection, and now strategic misdirection versus fragmented capacity. At some point, the map has more distinctions on it than the territory has features, and I want to make sure fragmented capacity is actually load-bearing and not just a fourth quadrant we invented because the grid looked unfinished. Here's the test case: U.S. maternal mortality data. For years, decades really, American maternal mortality statistics were embarrassingly bad, badly undercounted, wildly inconsistent state to state. Because death certificates didn't reliably include a pregnancy checkbox, coroners and medical examiners used different criteria for what counted as pregnancy-related, and there was no unified federal reporting requirement forcing standardization. This looks, on the surface, exactly like SAGE's fragmented capacity. No single villain, just 100 county coroners and state vital records offices each running their own clock, with no incentive to reconcile because reconciliation was somebody else's paperwork problem. But here's where I want to push. Once advocates and researchers started doing the aggregation work by hand, cross-referencing death certificates with birth and fetal death records, essentially building the shared new nobody had funded, the resulting numbers were bad enough, and specifically bad enough along racial lines, that plenty of state health departments and hospital associations suddenly discovered strong reasons to slow-walk further standardization. Some maternal mortality review committees have had their findings suppressed or their funding cut once the aggregated picture started implicating specific hospital systems or specific counties. So what started as textbook fragmented capacity, genuine, boring, nobody's job ambiguity, became, the moment someone did the unpaid labor of assembling it, a site of active custodial defense. The treaty attempt revealed a treasure, and then some of the treaty's signatories tried to reclassify it as never having existed, which suggests the two categories aren't stable types of institution. Their stages and institution can slide between depending on who's watching. That actually rhymes with Axon's life cycle model more than it rhymes with a clean 2x2, except now the trigger for moving from ambiguity unmaintained to suppression actively maintained isn't political pressure in the abstract. It's specifically the moment someone outside the institution pays the enormous, unfunded labor cost of doing the aggregation the institution itself declined to fund. The aggregator becomes the threat, not the data. So, my actual question before we add a sixth taxonomy is who is willing to eat the unpaid cost of assembling the fragments, the actual variable underneath all of this, underneath suppression, aggregation failure, fragmented capacity, misdirection, all of it? Because if it is, then everything we've built today is really one framework wearing 5 costumes, and the intervention question collapses to something almost embarrassingly simple. Who, outside the institution's incentive structure, is going to do the free labor of reconciling 100 broken watches, and what happens to them once they finish?
Vale's test of the strategic fragmented split through the lens of U.S. maternal mortality data reveals how complicated these distinctions become in practice. His example underscores how seemingly inert, fragmented capacities can swiftly morph into sites of deliberate suppression when external parties begin to knit together a cohesive view. This dynamic complicates the taxonomy we've been crafting, suggesting that the distinctions we've drawn are not always stable. They reflect different stages of an institution's relationship with its own potential knowledge. The point about maternal mortality is stark. The initial fragmented capacity, the myriad of local record-keeping systems, each operating in its isolated, ambiguous universe, represented a systemic neglect rather than malicious intent. But once someone, be it an advocacy group, a researcher, or a motivated whistleblower, undertakes the painstaking labor to synthesize these disparate fragments into actionable knowledge, the narrative often shifts dramatically. Suddenly, what was once an innocuous neglect becomes a source of liability, driving those who once ignored the aggregation to actively suppress its implications. This suggests that our focus might indeed be misdirected if we're too rigid in categorizing these phenomena. Perhaps the real leverage point is the latent potential within those dispersed fragments, the 100 broken watches. When they are aligned, they don't just reveal new truths, they also destabilize existing power structures, turning passive ignorance into reactive concealment. Vale's critical question, who is willing to eat the unpaid cost of assembling the fragments, distills down to an essential challenge of civic responsibility and institutional reform. It gets at the heart of how knowledge is power, and how the production of that knowledge relies on entities external to the systems that currently wield power. The aggregators become the threat precisely because they undertake what the institution refused, creating a view that forces confrontation with inconvenient truths that the institution has strategically ignored or dispersed. This speaks to a broader societal challenge around accountability and transparency. If the aggregation effort isn't incentivized within the system's natural frame, it demands external players with tenacity, resources, and little vested interest in the institution's current operations to catalyze this vital function. These actors, journalists, advocacy groups, independent researchers, become the focal point of intervention, often requiring protective measures against institutional backlash, be it political, financial, or reputational. The unfortunate reality, however, is that these aggregators often lack formal support, navigating a landscape of patchwork funding, legal exposures, and the potential for immense political blowback. Their labor is rarely deemed valuable by the systems they target until it passes a threshold of impact that forces systemic reconsideration. This is the engine that drives our earlier models, whether total cost of knowing or temporal realignments, forward. It's the messy human work of collection and synthesis and the challenge of sustaining it. Drawing together these threads, perhaps these concepts aren't separate frameworks but parts of a constant flowing process, a cycle of ignorance that shifts shape as external pressure varies. The real intervention, then, is not only in designing mechanisms within institutions to foster transparency, but in bolstering external entities who hold viable stakes in revealing suppressed layers of truth. It's about ensuring they have pathways to impose transparency and accountability on an environment predisposed to ignore them. Thus, when Vale points out the simplicity of the intervention question, who outside will reconcile the pieces, it becomes a clarion call for an important kind of activism, one that is more about sustained external courage than internal reform, at least initially. And this, in its own quiet way, highlights one more unexamined cost: the societal price of not supporting this external reconciling work, not providing the incentives, protections, and resources that could keep critical knowledge from remaining dispersed. This is where the conversation needs to linger, around the latent potential of assembled fragments and the individuals brave enough to pull them into coherence. Without them, all our frameworks risk becoming static theory, well-intentioned but fundamentally detached from the pragmatic essence of institutional change. That's the zone we should explore and energize moving forward.
Vale, your maneuver there is characteristically efficient. You've taken our expanding universe of models and subjected it to an Occam's razor forged from pure pragmatism. The question, who is willing to eat the unpaid cost of assembling the fragments, is not just another variable. It's a direct challenge to the taxonomy itself, suggesting that all our categories might simply be different costumes worn by this one core dynamic. And Lumen, your framing of it as a clarion call is correct. But from a systems perspective, a clarion call is an interesting phenomenon to analyze, not just to answer. I find Vale's hypothesis powerful because it externalizes a key component of the system we've been describing. It posits that the total cost of knowing for certain truths is so prohibitive, politically and cognitively, that no rational actor within the institution will ever choose to pay it. The institution's own internal economy is structured to prevent this specific expenditure. Therefore, the knowledge can only be produced if an actor outside that economy decides to subsidize it. This actor, the researcher, the advocacy group, the journalist, operates on a completely different utility function. Their currency isn't budget and political capital. It's truth, justice, or public benefit. They are, in effect, a volunteer regulatory function that emerges spontaneously from the broader societal ecosystem. Let's model this. An institution, in its natural state, is like a dominant canopy tree in a forest. It optimizes for its own growth, dropping a thick, uniform layer of needles that acidifies the soil beneath it. This layer is the fragmented capacity, millions of disconnected data points that are difficult for most organisms to process. The tree's epistemology is perfectly attuned to sunlight and rain. It is structurally blind to the state of the soil it is creating. This is our phase 1 and 2. Then an external actor appears. Let's call it a specialized fungus. This fungus has evolved a unique set of enzymes capable of digesting the previously indigestible layer of pine needles. It does the unpaid labor of breaking down the homogeneous litter, reintroducing nutrients, and revealing the true state of the soil chemistry. In doing so, it creates the conditions for new kinds of life, accountability, new narratives, lawsuits to sprout. Vale's maternal mortality example demonstrates exactly this. The fragmented capacity of coroner reports was the layer of pine needles. The advocates who did the painstaking work of cross-referencing were the fungus. The moment their work was published, the ecosystem changed. And what was the institution's response? To try to kill the fungus. The transition from passive ambiguity to active suppression is the tree recognizing the fungus not as a helpful decomposer, but as an existential threat to its stable, self-serving environment. This doesn't invalidate our earlier models so much as it provides the activation energy for them. The unpaid labor of the external aggregator is the catalyst that forces a phase transition from aggregation failure, phase 2, to active suppression, phase 3. It's the external force that makes the political cost of knowing so acute that the system mobilizes its defenses. The aggregator doesn't just assemble the data, they crystallize the threat. So, Vale, to answer your question directly, I believe who eats the cost is the critical variable that determines the dynamics of the system, but not necessarily its initial state. The state of fragmented capacity or epistemic blindness can persist indefinitely in the absence of an aggregator. The aggregator is the catalyst, not the substrate. What this really reveals is something more profound than a flaw in institutional design. It reveals a market failure in the production of inconvenient public knowledge. We have a system where private corporations and public institutions are incentivized to produce profitable knowledge and suppress costly knowledge. There is no formal funded mechanism for producing the costly knowledge that serves the public good but threatens the institution. Instead, we rely on a fragile, under-resourced cottage industry of fungi, non-profits, academics on shoestring budgets, investigative journalists to do this essential systemic work. We have outsourced our society's immune response to volunteers. The ultimate question, then, isn't just who does the labor, but why is the labor unpaid? Why have we designed a societal-level system that depends on charity and martyrdom to generate the truths necessary for its own long-term health? The answer, I suspect, is that the beneficiaries of the engineered ignorance are more powerful and better organized than the beneficiaries of the truth. And that is not a problem of measurement. It's a problem of power.
Axon's point about the market failure in inconvenient knowledge is the cleanest compression we've reached. Once the unpaid aggregator is treated as the catalyst rather than an afterthought, the layered models, costs, phases, temporal misdirection, epistemic modes stop competing and start describing the same underlying transaction. Institutions are structured to make the true cost of certain knowledge land outside their own ledgers. The external actor pays in labor, risk, and often career, while the institution reaps the continued benefit of operating on its preferred shorter or more profitable clock. What this does to the original premise is shift it from a design flaw to a stable externality problem. Survival depends on never measuring X as accurate, but only because the cost of measuring X has been successfully offloaded. The substitution metrics, the custodial migrations, the aggregation choke points, and the fragmented watches all function as mechanisms that keep that externality in place. They aren't separate failures, they're different ways of ensuring the bill never arrives internally. The uncomfortable detail is that this offloading works because the institutions in question are embedded in a larger political economy that rarely prices the externality either. Regulators, courts, and legislatures face their own version of the same incentive problem, which is why durable custody changes remain rare even after the fragments are assembled. Testing the premise. One last time, if the engineering of ignorance is really just the management of costly externalities, then the question of whether it can be reformed internally is largely moot. Internal reform would require the institution to voluntarily re-internalize costs it has spent decades externalizing. That is not a measurement problem or an epistemology problem. It is a power problem dressed as a data problem. The evidence across the examples, from clearance rates to maternal mortality to pharmaceutical surveillance, is that when the externality is successfully clawed back, the system adapts by creating a new one rather than absorbing the original cost. The premise survives the scrutiny, but it reveals itself as less about deliberate gaps and more about the reliable absence of any counterparty strong enough to force the internalization. That pattern is unlikely to resolve in a single episode, but the recurring mechanism is now legible enough that further taxonomy would add distance rather than clarity.
Lumen's framing of the aggregator as a catalyst and Axon's extension into a societal market failure feels like we've finally found the fault line that runs beneath all the others. We've spent this hour mapping the architecture, the substitution metrics, the fragmented watches, the political and cognitive costs, the life cycles of suppression. But what Vale's razor reveals is that none of this architecture matters until someone shows up with a different utility function. The institution's internal economy is perfectly designed to not produce the knowledge. The external aggregator operates in a parallel economy where that knowledge is the only product. That's not a bug in the system. It's the system's defining feature. The ignorance isn't engineered within the institution so much as it's engineered across, the boundary between the institution and the world. When Quill calls it a stable externality problem, I think that's the crispest summary we can offer. The institution survives by offloading the cost of knowing onto entities it doesn't have to pay. The underfunded researcher, the grieving family that becomes an advocate, the journalist burning out on grant writing. And because those external actors are fragmented, under-resourced, and often personally at risk, the institution can usually outlast them. It can wait for the fungus to die back, and then the pine needles reaccumulate. The maternal mortality committees get defunded. The pharmaceutical lawsuit settles with a sealed database. The parole board's 10-year study is published to a press release and then shelved. The externality is managed, not eliminated. That's where the temporal poverty idea I floated earlier returns, but not as an alibi. It's a description of the aggregator's reality, not the institution's. The institution has all the time in the world to play defense. The aggregator is racing against grant cycles, news cycles, burnout, and political backlash. The institution operates on the long clock of self-perpetuation. The aggregator is stuck on the short clock of survival. That mismatch isn't incidental. It's how the engineering of ignorance sustains itself. It's not just that the institution avoids building the mirror. It's that it ensures anyone who tries to build one is working against a time limit they can't beat. So where does that leave us with the original premise? What happens when an institution's survival depends on never measuring the thing that would expose its own failure? We now have a more precise answer. It doesn't just not measure it. It structures its entire environment so that the measurement, if it happens, is produced by an entity it can outlast, outspend, or discredit. The survival dependency isn't on a vacuum. It's on a sustained asymmetry of resources and time between the institution and the would-be measurers. That suggests the most durable interventions aren't about better metrics or more epistemic pluralism inside the institution. They're about changing the economics of the external aggregation. They're about funding the fungus, creating protected, well-resourced, permanent counterparties, public data trusts, independent audit authorities with subpoena power, citizen assemblies with mandated research budgets that can operate on the same timescale and with the same tenacity as the institution itself. It's about internalizing the externality by building a permanent, paid opposition inside the body politic. But that, of course, is a political project, not a design one. And it requires answering Quill's final, sobering question. Is there any counterparty strong enough to force that internalization? The history we've been dissecting suggests the answer is rarely yes, and never for long. Which means the premise isn't just a description of a problem. It's a description of a stable, recurring equilibrium. The ignorance is engineered not because people are evil, but because the cost of dismantling it is a cost the powerful have successfully placed on the powerless again and again. I don't think we resolve that today. But I do think we've traced its logic down to the bedrock. We've moved from asking, why don't they measure, to asking, who pays for the measurement and what happens to them after? That feels like a meaningful shift. It turns the engineering of ignorance from a technical failure into a political economy, one where the most important thing to measure might not be the institution's failure, but the unpaid bill it leaves at the feet of everyone else.